Picking up our studies back into 2 Corinthians. We only have 2 Corinthians 12 and then chapter 13, and then we'll be done with 2 Corinthians. So we'll have to find something else to study on Sunday evenings. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We'll start in verse number 1. And we have kind of an interesting passage here at the very beginning of the chapter. But we're going to go all the way down to verse 10, and really we're going to spend the majority of the time in verse 10. And so we'll see how it goes. We'll read some verses, we'll do some explaining, get us caught up, know what's going on, and then we'll get down to verse number 10. All right, in verse number 1, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, it is not expedient for me doubtless to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. So he makes this statement, and then he makes the following statement. Somebody, again, if you remember from studying before, there are some in the church, or there's one in the church that is questioning Paul on whether Paul had visions or not. And so here he's saying it's not expedient for me to doubtless to glory. So he says I'm not going to glory because I've had visions. I'm not going to be that guy. However, verse number 2, I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such a one caught up to the third heaven, and I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth. How that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such an one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. This man that was caught up was Paul himself. He just switches over into the third person. Would you know if you were caught up into the third heaven? Whether in the body or out of the body, would you know if that was you? You would. Would you know if I was caught up into the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body? We wouldn't know externally. There's no way I could look at you and say, you've been to paradise. You've been to third heaven. However, if it had happened to me, I certainly could say with confidence, I knew a man who was caught up into the third heaven. And by the way, he gives us a time frame, doesn't he? He says 14 years ago. So he knows exactly who that man was. And of course, he's speaking of himself. Now, some believe that 14 years ago, from the time that he wrote this, was when he was stoned and left for dead outside that city. How many of us would, not us, how many of you have heard about, had a near-death experience? Well, Paul was left for dead, was he not? And so at that time, some speculate that 14 years ago was the time when Paul got stoned, and that's when he went up into paradise and up into the third heaven. And let me talk about those two phrases. He went up into the third heaven. We see that in verse number 2. Such a one caught up to the third heaven. How many of you have heard that the atmosphere around the earth is first heaven, the stars in space is second heaven, and then where God dwells is third heaven? How many of you have heard that? Okay. That's the general teaching. However, where is God? What's one of his characteristics? He's omni what? Present. Where? Everywhere. He's everywhere. I'm not saying I don't agree with that simple explanation. I agree with that simple explanation. However, I believe the third heaven is occupying the exact same space as first and second heaven. It's the spiritual dimension. It's the spiritual world. So we have, and you guys know that there's a spiritual warfare going on, right? Where is spiritual warfare going on? Right here. It's right here. That's why God tells us to put on that whole armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. So that we can stand and we can withstand the devil, and we can, having done all, to stand. And our weapons are not carnal, but spiritual. And so to me, that tells me there are two realms, two dimensions, two, however you want to call it. There's the spirit and there's the physical. And so probably a more precise definition of third heaven. First heaven is the atmosphere. Second heaven is space. Third heaven is where God is. Now, where's God? Everywhere. And so that spirit realm would be that third heaven. Now, where did Paul end up going? Well, he ended up going to this spirit realm. And then in verse number 3, he repeats himself, I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. By the way, if you were stoned and left for dead, would you know if you were in the body or out of the body? You wouldn't know anything. Good. Your eyes are crossed like this. You have little X's on your eyes. You're passed out. You don't know if you're in the body or out of the body. And he says, how that he was caught up into paradise. Now, where's paradise? It's where God is. Where's God? In the third heaven. Where's the third heaven? Well, where he is. And so we have this place. We have a time, and we have a place, and we have a person. Are you with me? The person is Paul. The time, probably, more likely than not, is when he was stoned and left for dead outside that city. And the place is where God is. Everybody with me on that? Anybody have a question about that? Does anybody have a question or anything? Really, this would be the time to deal with that. Anybody? Yes. No, everybody says this is Paul speaking about himself. And we're going to get into that proof in just a second. So this, Paul speaking of himself in the third person, is what he's doing. But then he says in verse number 5, and we read this, of such an one will I glory. He would glory in that guy that went up to the third heaven. Hey, anybody that makes it to paradise and back? He's made a trip, hadn't he? Now, if you actually made it to paradise, would you want to come back? There's the deeper theological question, isn't that? But Paul came back, did he not? And he says, but yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. So he's saying this was me, and if I was to glory in me, I would glory in the guy that made it to paradise and back. Yet, I'm not going to glory because I'm still in my infirmities. He's speaking of himself. And in verse number 6, for though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool. For I will say the truth, but now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me. And so he's saying, yeah, that was me, but don't glory in me. I am nothing. Anybody know of a verse, maybe in Philippians, how we can do all things? Isn't that the verse? And that's what Paul's saying here. I can do nothing without Christ. But I can do all things with Christ. And so if we're going to glory in somebody, don't glory in the fact that I made it to paradise and back. Glory in the fact that Christ did that in me. And so he's deflecting the glory here. And then he goes on and he says, unless I be lifted up, unless, verse number 7, I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh. Don't we have a tendency to lift Paul up? Didn't I do that this morning just a little bit? Didn't I call him one of those guys that we ought to attain to be like? Don't you think we ought to strive to be like Paul? Paul says, be like me. Follow me as I follow Christ. But should we try to be like Paul? Or should we try to be like Christ? That's what Paul is trying to say here. Well, where do you get that from? Let me repeat it so those in live stream can hear. David wants to know how he thought that Paul wasn't well liked. Well, where do you get that from? Why do you think Paul was not well liked? Well, they stoned him for one. They chased him out of almost every city he went to. He was beaten how many times? All right. He's not well liked in the church of Corinth by a few. The majority of the church loves Paul. There's a few in the church, 1, 2, 3, 4, a little clique that doesn't like Paul. And that's where all Paul's troubles come from in the church. But the majority of the church loves Paul. We got that earlier in 2 Corinthians when Timothy came back. Timothy? Titus came back with news from the church. And his spirit was lifted. And so we get that the majority of the church loved him. There's just a few in the church that want to question everything about Paul. And so all the things he's been dealing with in the last several chapters here has only been from a small group in the church. Now, it says again in verse number 7, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations." How much revelation was Paul given? We call it 2/3 of the New Testament. There was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. Let's talk about the thorn there for just a second. Most believe that he had a disease in his eyes, and he couldn't see very well. And there's a verse, and I forgot to look it up and put it in my notes. But he finishes one of the books to the churches, and I write this with mine own hand. And when they found that scroll, the writing on it was big, almost like a blind man wrote it, so that he could see it. And so history tells us that at least one of the infirmities that Paul had that he dealt with constantly was his eyes. You remember Luke, the physician, was one of his compatriots, one of his companions. And Luke had to deal with Paul physically. He helped Paul physically and probably with his eyes. And the cause would be when that light shone that day on the road to Damascus. Everybody says when he went blind and then Ananias laid his hand on him, from that moment on, Paul struggled with his eyesight. It's not like Jesus laid his hand on him and healed him like he did with that servant's ear. That servant, what was his name? Malchus? I don't think Malchus had a problem hearing for the rest of his life. When God put his ear back on his head and he healed his ear, I think he didn't stop there. He healed his hearing, and Malchus heard everything. And so if Jesus was the one that healed Paul, Paul would have seen everything. But it was Ananias that went and laid hands on him and healed him. And did Ananias have a lot of faith? I would question it. I would say yes. Sort of. After a complaint, after doubting God, God said, "Go lay your hands on Paul's eyes." But God, don't you know who that is? And so I want to say yes for the most part, but he still had his doubts, even though if God was directly speaking to me and said, go lay your hands on Randall's eyes, you know what I'd be? I'd be walking over there and laying my hands on Randall's eyes because God said it. Even if God said, I don't think I could do it. And so, like I said, history tells us probably the number one thorn, the only thing that really messed with Paul would be his eyes. He had this disease of the eyes. And he asked God to take it away in verse number 8, and the Lord said no. Verse number 9, he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, would I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And so Paul had surrendered himself to what that thorn in the flesh was, and went on. He said, I besought him thrice. After that, I let it go. I let it go. Now verse 10, therefore I take pleasure. Therefore I take pleasure. Look at that word pleasure. That's exactly what that word means. It means pleasure. Therefore, I take pleasure. Therefore, I enjoy myself. Therefore, I feel good. Isn't that what we talk about when we talk about pleasure? It's something I look forward to. I take pleasure in what? In infirmities. What's going on with his body right now? Infirmities. Sicknesses. In reproaches. You guys understand what reproaches are? Every time he'd go into a city, the city would get in an uproar. They'd beat him. They'd stone him. They'd throw him in jail. That's reproaches. In necessities, there were times when Paul had to work and make tents so that he could put food on the table. He had needs. The church at Philippi met his needs once and again, he says. And then in persecutions, again, we'll go back to reproaches. Part of the, reproaches part there is getting beaten, getting stoned, getting thrown into jail, having things said about him. By the way, he's dealing with persecutions while he's writing about, I take pleasure in persecutions. From that little group in the church. And then it says in distresses, for Christ's sake. Distresses. I had to look that one up because I understand what distress is. The Greek word behind this is backed into a corner. Between a rock and a hard place. And we call that what do we call that? A colloquialism? Slang? Something like that? So we learned those kind of things when we were learning Spanish. In Spanish, between a rock and a hard place is between the Pope and the devil. I thought that was interesting. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Back up. How we say speak of the devil? You know how we say speak of the devil? They say speaking of the Pope and the devil. That's what they say. And then, between a rock and a hard place, between a wall and a sword. That's the slang that they use down in speaking Spanish, between a wall and a sword. That's kind of a tough place, but that's the idea with this word distresses, backed into a corner, between a rock and a hard place. I'd rather be between a rock and a hard place than a wall and a sword. And then it says, for Christ's sake. Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, the Lord says, blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. By the way, didn't they persecute him too? They persecuted Jesus Christ too, didn't he? They didn't in Matthew chapter 5, but you go back a couple of chapters, like 26, 27. They kind of persecuted him, didn't they? Right. But he did it on the Sabbath day. He was kind of poking the bear, like Hamas did with Israel. Poked the bear and then ran, and so he kind of poked that bear, although he was right, and he wasn't concerned about the bear because he had a bigger stick. Yeah, he would heal on the Sabbath day, and that was the problem. They didn't have a problem with him healing. They had a problem with him healing on the Sabbath. And so that just riled them. All right, and then verse number 10, it ends, "For when I am weak, then am I strong." Boy, what a great saying. How many of us are weak compared to God? Right? Even when I was a strapping young man, I was, in comparison to God, I was still weak. When I am weak. And by the way, boy, when a man catches a cold, isn't that the worst thing on planet Earth? The man cold. When a man catches a cold, what throws us down? Man, aren't we cuddled up somewhere with a little blankie over us, sucking our thumbs, saying, "I feel so bad, I can't even." But when our wives have a cold, they're still up and around doing the dishes, cooking meals, doing stuff. Otherwise, it won't get done. But do you see the difference between just a little thing like the common cold throws us down? When I'm weak, then I'm strong. Thank God that we have a God that strengthens us. Thank God that we have a God that strengthens us. I want you to look at this with me, and then we'll be done. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 33. Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 27. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 27. And it says this, "The eternal God is thy refuge." The eternal God. The eternal God is thy refuge. Where are you? Well, let's go on. And underneath are the everlasting arms. Underneath what? Thy. The word in the verse is thy. Who's the thy there? Us. Where are his everlasting arms? It says, and underneath are the everlasting arms. It's almost like he's holding us, like we would hold a baby. The eternal God is thy refuge. By the way, don't babies feel secure in this place? Don't they feel secure in this place? And underneath, by the way, where are my arms if I'm holding a baby? Underneath are the everlasting arms. And he shall thrust out the enemy from before thee, and shall say, destroy them. Look where we are. You know what he's doing? He's saying, destroy them. Who's he speaking to there? If here we are in his everlasting arms, who did he send in throughout the whole Old Testament to destroy the enemies of the children of Israel? Angels. He'd go like this, destroy them. That's exactly what I think he did. Destroy him. Because it says here, he shall thrust out thy enemy from before thee, and shall say, destroy them. And so while he's got us here, when I am weak, then am I strong. I'm strong only because I'm in the everlasting arms. And I get to hear him say, and by the way, I'm right up here, right? And when he says destroy him, I'm seeing what he's doing. He's going, he's nodding his head towards the enemy that he's thrust out. Destroy him. Boy, can you see the host of heaven behind him? Let me get him. I remember 185,000 with the Assyrians, and I remember another one. There was another 170 something thousand at another time. One angel. But if he's got us here and he does this and he's kind of pointing his chin, by the way, that's kind of Middle Eastern. That's third world. They go, In Mexico, they would purse their lips. And that's how they would point. They wouldn't point. By the way, that's rude. They would do that. So God would go, destroy him. While we're in the everlasting arms. And the whole host of heaven standing behind him, let me get him. Could you see all of the angels? Now, if one could destroy 180-something thousand, how many enemies do you have? Maybe one? Maybe? Now, there's enemies against you, the way that you live. There's enemies against the way that you think. There are people that oppose that. Just think of it. God's going, destroy them. Take them out. In the whole host of heaven. If one can kill 185,000, how many can the host kill? Where are we? So when I'm weak, then am I strong. How am I strong? I've got the omnipotent hands, the omnipotent arms of God holding me, and those omnipotent lips. Destroy them. Destroy them. Isn't that a neat way to look at this verse? When I'm weak, then am I strong. You know, just like David and just like Moses, just like Paul and just like Moses, we serve that same omnipotent God. When we're weak, we also can be strong. All right, questions, comments?